What is up, guys? Welcome back to another GeekaWhat video. In this one, I'm going to be building an awesome 1440p gaming PC build capable of smashing through all of the latest AAA titles. I'll be taking you guys along for the ride too, covering off the best parts to pick, some alternative choices for good measure, how to assemble the system, and how well it will perform a little bit later, with detailed gaming benchmarks too. Let's do this. I'm going to start things off by talking through the CPU, motherboard and RAM I selected for this build. AMD's Ryzen 5 7600X sits front and centre. Although I'm a huge fan of Intel's 13th Gen i5, this CPU has simply become such good value, it wins out every time at the moment as far as my recommendations go. Great clock speeds, decent multi-threaded performance, and strong results across the board in all the latest titles. What's more, you can also go ahead and pick yourself up a slightly cheaper motherboard as well than the expensive X670E options out there, such as this ASUS ROG B650EF Gaming. Now, you still get lots of features that you'd find on more expensive motherboards, but without necessarily the price tag to match. So PCI Gen 5 for your NVMe and your graphics card are both present, 4 RAM DIMM slots, DDR5 only for Ryzen 7000, loads of expandability, and then on the rear I/O, you've also got great connectivity too. 10 gig USB-C and A, 2.5 gig Ethernet, Wi-Fi 6E, a 20 gig Type-C next to the audio ports for some reason. Don't know why they've done that. But anyway, it's a really solid board and looks amazing. To be clear, you can go even cheaper. Something like this, the ASROCK A620M Pro RS. This drops you down a chipset. You lose PCI Gen 5, you lose overclocking for the CPU, but it's a good alternative budget choice. If you're going to overclock the CPU though, definitely go for a B650 board like this one. I have to say, I'm a huge fan of AMD having moved away from the pins on CPU. The pins instead are on the motherboard socket, allowing us to really easily line up the Ryzen processor, triangle to triangle, pop the cover down, and add the retention arm into place. DRAM wise, I've picked up this. It's a Thermaltake kit. I've gone for a bit of a Thermaltake build theme, as you can see here today. The Toughram RGB D5 is a nice option. I think I've used this kit when it was DDR4, but I'm not sure about DDR5 with this particular SKU, and I like it. I really like. Thermaltake have been bringing out some quite cool stuff recently, and this Toughram D5 is no exception. Nice RGB heat spreaders, that's pretty normal, with this nice sort of metallic section. It's just good. Different speeds available, different latencies. You might want to go slightly higher speed than this particular kit, break through that 6000 megahertz mark. It's going to pop into slots 2 and slots 4 in this build. Technically, they're slots 1 and 3 because DRAM slots start at 0, but anyway, going to work absolutely fine and look pretty good. Final thing to install onto the motherboard as I look around and try and find it is the SSD. This is the WD Black SN850 lineup, a 1TB drive, an amazing deal right now. There's so many cost savings to be had on the latest SSDs from the Gen 4 lineup. This one's no exception. Heatsink or non-heatsink, both versions are available. Doesn't really matter for this build. I've picked up the heatsink version and will be removing the included heatsink design to make way for this heatsink version. I'll link my favorite NVMe drives and all the other parts for this build at the links in the description below. The last thing to do before popping the motherboard to one side and moving on to the case, which is next up, is to actually open up the cooler. Now, typically, the installation's going to happen later once the motherboard is in the chassis. However, some coolers require a lot of prep on the CPU, which can be easier to do when the whole thing is out of the case. So let me try and find the instruction manual. Aha! AMD. As you can see from the manual, the cooler actually clips onto these existing black brackets. These will come pre-installed on any motherboard and means there actually isn't really any prep to be done at all right now, making our life really that little bit easier. I'm going to clear some space on the desk and bring in the case as it looks like we can move on nice and easily. The case is then finally able to come into the fold, and this is the Thermaltake Ceres 300. You might recognize this case vaguely if you saw our videos on the Ceres 500 or anyone's videos for that fact, but you should totally subscribe here because ours are amazing. Anyway, this is basically the 500 but smaller. The name kind of gives that away. I like this more than the 500 actually. It's still an ATX chassis, so it's not like you're confined to micro ATX motherboards or anything like that. But the difference is, the whole thing is just a bit more compact. You're going to lose like water cooling room and maybe a little bit of expandability, but on the whole, there really isn't a lot that's going to suffer. You can definitely spend a bit more money on this case than what it goes for at MSRP, but all in all, I really quite like it. The first step really is to pop the motherboard in. With this being an ATX chassis and an ATX board, all the standoffs are going to be in the right locations. You can see the board proportionally fits really well. There's a bit of room up top for a radiator. The rad mount is sort of recessed to allow room for the motherboard, but nothing too major. Add in the 9 standoff screws and that's going to hold the whole board into place. Once that's been done, I then need to do a bit of switching around of fans. My intention is to put the 360mm rad for this build at the front of the case, a little bit overkill for the Ryzen 5, but not chronically overkill, and then move the existing 140mm to the top. I think 3 120mm up top here is going to look a little bit tight and a little bit silly. The 240s on the other hand should look quite good. So move the fans around first, then I'm going to go ahead and deal with the radiator. Before that, I need to obviously add in our 120mm fans at the front. So 3 RGB units are going to go in here, while the actual radiator will slot in behind. Now this is a bit fiddly and a bit noisy, so bear with me. There we go. Right, I think a couple of screws, that'll start holding it together and make things a bit more logical to understand. To round things off, you need to open up the included bag of thumb screws and these D brackets, and then also take this. This is our AMD retention bracket. I'm going to go ahead and pop the D bracket through the retention bracket, a little something like so, and then add a thumb screw onto the end. So a couple of turns, nice and loose, nothing too tight. Repeat this for both sides, which should give you something that looks a little bit like this. Then take the water block itself and slide this bracket. There we go, got there in the end. Remove the included protective film. Ugh. Before adding a smidge of thermal paste onto our Ryzen 5 processor, not really too much more than that. Save the rest spare thermal paste for later, and then the cooler itself is going to clip on to those black AMD plastic stock mounting brackets. Couple of screwdriver turns on the screws on the bottom and the top of the cooler. That'll make it nice and tight, and this fan cable will run to one of the fan headers on the motherboard. The next part on the list is graphics. In some respects, this choice might be slightly controversial. It is the ASUS RTX 4070 Dual. And a year or so ago, if you told me a 70-tier NVIDIA GPU would be a controversial choice, I probably would have laughed in your face. But of course, there has been a bit of water under the bridge with NVIDIA recently. There aren't, to be totally honest, many cards in the 40 series lineup I could recommend, given their value proposition relative to AMD, but the 4070 is one of them. You do, of course, get all the NVIDIA bells and whistles, DLSS 3, ray tracing, and it is incredibly power efficient. The 4070 has got to be one of the most power efficient GPUs ever. Straight rasterization is good, and the 12GB of video memory means NVIDIA have avoided the painful mistakes they made with the 4060 and the 4060 Ti. A really solid option, and one of the only cards AMD haven't really got a direct answer to yet. This dual card is also going to fit perfectly in the build scheme today, and is one of the cheaper 4070s. Important when we're trying to justify this GPU's value proposition. Hover it over the slot and you can see, yeah, we're in a pretty good place. That looks good, clearance is solid, only a single 8-pin power connector. What's not to love? Remove the PCI lane, slide the GPU in and get it secured with the included thumb screws, and we're pretty much good to go. Slide it in. Yes, lovely stuff. Couple of screws, pop the PCI cover back on, and we're all good, baby. Absolutely flying. The final thing then is to add in the PSU. I've gone for this ToughPower GF A3 850. If I'm honest with you, it's a bit overkill. I'll link the 750 alternatives to this down below, which will be fine with the super power efficient RTX 4070, but a bit of headway. And if you did want a more powerful GPU, the 6950 XT is a great option at this budget as well, but consumes considerably more power. This might be worth considering. It does also work on the ATX 3 standard with that new PCI Gen 5 power cable. You pay a bit more for that. Some people will think that's a worthwhile upgrade, some people won't, but as I say, I'll link it down below. Once all the cables and stuff are in though, the build is pretty much ready to go, and I think looking sick. And once these are all in, the build is basically ready to go. I think this thing is going to look sick when it's all powered up, but there's only one way to find out. It's time for an awesome GeekaWhat montage before I rejoin you for the performance and gaming benchmarks. It's now time to check out the performance of this system. And as usual, here at GeekaWhat, we've tested a wide variety of titles to make sure the build really cuts the mustard. I'm going to start things off by looking at F1 2023 at 1440p ultra high with DLSS enabled and set to quality. What a mouthful. In the latest F1 title, I'm a massive F1 fan by the way, this build achieved 140 FPS on average for a really consistent smooth gaming experience. We also saw very similarly positive results in the likes of Call of Duty's Warzone 2. 1440p high in this title yielded 106 FPS on average, really not too bad. While the sister title to this game, Call of Duty's Modern Warfare 2, very similar game mechanics and overall design, delivered 105 FPS on average. In games like Overwatch 2, an albeit easier to run title, but still something we want to test out, the build delivered amazing results, 247 FPS on average at 1440p is pretty crazy, while titles like Apex also stacked up wow, 172 FPS on average with consistent 90 and 99 percentile results for good measure. Fortnite was also on the list, of course, very easy to run again, 265 FPS on average. You really can't go too far wrong in Fortnite with some awesomely consistent frame rates and some great results. Hogwarts Legacy was also on the list, 1440p high here, and the build achieved 84 FPS on average. Really not too bad, with awesome visuals too. Remember, this is 1440p that we've done most of our testing at. More frame rate is of course available if you drop the resolution down to 1080p, so definitely bear that in mind. If you want to build this system for yourself, check out the parts linked at the affiliate links below, and I hope this video has been useful. Thanks for tuning in, get subscribed to see more from me, and as always, I'll see you in the next one.